Okay, well, it's a privilege for us all to welcome Russ Mittermeier as this year's winner of the Indianapolis Prize for Conservation. He is currently Chief Conservation Officer for Global Wildlife Conservation, which is an organization that uses science-based field activity to conserve endangered species and habitats. Before his current position, until 2014, he was president at Conservation International for 25 years. He's held equivalently prominent positions in conservation organizations throughout his career, but I want to point out that tonight he is coming home. We can be proud to say that Russ is not only a research associate at the Museum of Comparative Zoology, but also he began his career as a graduate student here in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard, advised by Irvin DeVore, writing his dissertation in 1977 on the primates of Suriname. He is warmly remembered. Only last year, he received the highest award given by the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, Harvard University's Centennial Medal for making contributions to society that emerged from his graduate studies at Harvard. Russ Mittermeier began as a primatologist and has maintained his interest in primates for more than 4 decades. For a blistering 41 years, he has been chair of the IUCN Species Survival Commission Primate Specialist Group. As a primatologist, he developed the idea of naming the 25 most threatened species of primates in the world, which leads him to chair an often chaotic meeting every 2 years at the International Primatological Congress, when advocates for different species vie to have their own study subjects named as one of the 25. A few weeks ago in Nairobi, he chaired that meeting once again. Among other initiatives, he's produced 3 concepts of great significance for conservation worldwide. First, he's done more than anyone to champion Norman Meyer's 1989 concept of 25 biodiversity hotspots, critical areas that warrant special investment of precious conservation resources. He's going to talk about that, but let me just mention that as one specific indication of the influence of the biodiversity hotspot concept, the 2000 paper, published in Nature by Myers, Mittermeier, and others, titled Biodiversity Hotspots for Conservation Priorities, has been cited an astonishing 11,000 times. Just to put that in perspective, the average scientific article, as I understand it, is never cited at all. Second is the naming of megadiversity countries, which prioritizes the 18 out of roughly 200 nations on Earth that contain 2/3 of the species of all global biodiversity. And the third of his very important concepts is the high biodiversity wilderness areas, which signifies biologically rich areas of the world, such as the tropical forests of Amazonia and the Congo, that fortunately still have a little bit of their habitat intact. Just to emphasize, this is no armchair theorist. Russ reckons to have traveled in 169 countries, to have conducted field work in 30 countries, most prominently in Amazonia and Brazil and Madagascar. He has described 18 new species of primates and turtles, and 8 species have been named after him, including 3 primates. He's published 35 books and more than 650 articles. So in a minute, I will ask you to welcome home this hero for the planet, as he was once described by Time magazine. But for the moment, we have a video that will first of all continue the introduction.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Richard. You know, when you give a presentation, you usually say, it's great to be in a particular place. But here at Harvard, I really mean it. It's just, Harvard is just a very, very special place to me, has been for a very long time, and I'll say a little bit more about that during the course of this presentation. Now, I always like to start off with one of my favorite images of a non-human primate. Anybody know what that one is? All right, very good. Emperor tamarin, which is named after Emperor Franz Josef of Austria for obvious reasons. And those are not fake mustaches. That's actually what this little monkey has. It comes from the upper Amazon region of South America. It's pretty cute, huh? Now, what I'm going to do is give you a few personal reflections, how I got into this business in the first place, and why Harvard is so special to me. And I'll talk a little bit about what biodiversity is. I think you all know, but I'll give you some of my definitions. What the threats are, these are also pretty well known, but it's nice to go through them and review what the most serious ones are. Then setting priorities, focusing in particular on hotspots and high biodiversity wilderness areas, and using two extremes. Suriname, which is still the most intact rainforest country on Earth, and Madagascar, which is one of the most devastated. Then I'll talk about some of the successes that we can replicate and learn from, the whole IUCN red listing process, the growing importance of ecotourism, the critical importance of protected areas and indigenous lands, nature-based solutions to climate change, and then I'll end with a little bit about the importance of celebrities and, of course, future generations. Now, people ask me why I'm in this business, how I got started, and I give a lot of credit to my mother. She was a German immigrant, a housewife. I was growing up in the Bronx and Brooklyn, not areas known for their biodiversity. And she would take me to the American Museum and of Natural History and the Bronx Zoo just about every week. So I kind of had a pre-adaptation towards wildlife to begin with. And then, very important, I discovered Tarzan. You know who that is, right? You know who that is? All right, good. Johnny Weissmuller and Lex Barker in particular were the Tarzans of my early years. And I found the Tarzan comics, the Tarzan books, the Tarzan movies. And very quickly, in my mind, I had this image of myself hanging off trees and hanging off a cliff with a monkey on my shoulder and exploring unknown lands. Now, when my mother was trying to enroll me in first grade in Catholic school, and we went in and met with the head nun. And she said, "What's your name, young man?" And I said, "Tarzan." And she said, "Well, we can't call you that here." And I said, "If you don't call me Tarzan, I won't go to your lousy school." And my mother dragged me outside and disciplined me a bit, and they wound up accepting me. And then about 6 months later, they asked me in first grade what I wanted to be, and I said, "Jungle explorer." And I kind of struck these poses thinking I was Tarzan at that time. Now, my interest in Harvard actually started very, very early because I think I was 11 when Kennedy was elected. And I was just fascinated, as so many people were. I was fascinated with John and Jackie Kennedy. And I decided then and there that I wanted to go to Harvard. I didn't get in the first time around. I wound up going to Dartmouth. But then I finally got in for graduate school. Wow, I was so happy. And I was in both the Peabody Museum and the Museum of Comparative Zoology. And I just visited again this morning. Very happy to be there again because I had an office there for 7 years. My advisor was the great Irvin DeVore, one of the greatest professors ever for primatology and lots of other things. And he really was inspirational. And one of the best things about him was he let me do whatever I wanted. I also connected up with the gentleman in the lower left-hand corner, Ernest Williams, who is one of the greatest herpetologists of all time. And Ernest actually gave me office space over in the first floor of the museum, and I was based there from 1971 to 1978. And of course, I had the great privilege of meeting and spending time with the greatest biologist of the 21st century and extending well into this century as well. And Richard mentioned the 8 species that are named after me. One of them is an ant. And Wilson named one of these ants after me. He was doing a revision of the genus Pheidole, and he came up with about 300 species new to science. So I think he named one after just about every person that he'd ever met. But I was greatly honored to have one of them named after me. And I also landed in Harvard in 1971, just as this whole sociobiology debate was heating up. And it was just one of these great periods of thought, just amazing intellectual stimulation everywhere. And of course, Wilson was the one who publicized that the most, but there was another fellow who I think deserves recognition, and that's Bob Trivers. Any of you know Bob Trivers? Richard does, of course, and a few others, but this guy was a lot of the theory behind it. And he doesn't get enough credit, but he was absolutely incredible. And he the first time he ever gave a course on sociobiology, I took it. And without the shadow of a doubt, that was the best course I ever took in my entire educational career. Now, while I was based here in graduate school, I started carrying out expeditions in the Amazon. And my best expedition to date, I think, after all the expeditions that I've done, was one I did in 1973, following in the footsteps of both Henry Walter Bates and Alfred Russel Wallace. I traced most of the routes that they had taken back in the middle of the 19th century. And these guys, of course, were among the best explorer naturalists in history. Wallace, of course, came up with the theory of evolution along with Darwin. And I was looking in particular for these monkeys. You know what these are? All right. You know all the answers. Yeah, these monkeys are bizarre creatures. They're still relatively poorly known. They're the only short-tailed Amazonian monkeys. And there were, at that time, a red one, a white one, and a black one. And although both Bates and Wallace reported on them, they never actually saw them in the wild. They only saw animals that had been brought in as pets. And I was fascinated by them, and I decided I was going to go and try to see them in the wild. And I succeeded in finding all three of them in the wild, but they live in these flooded Igapó forests of the central and western Brazilian Amazon, which is almost impossible to get around in. So I decided I was going to study some species that were a little bit easier for my thesis. So after 2 years in the Amazon, I came back to Herb de Boer, and he said, "Oh, you ready to write your thesis?" I said, "No, I think I'm going to start all over again." And to his credit, he said, "All right, do what you're going to do." I also spent a lot of time in the Atlantic forest region of Brazil working on animals like the golden lion tamarin and the muriqui, which is the largest of the South American monkeys. These animals back in the 70s and 80s were considered on the verge of extinction because of a lot of effort, especially by our Brazilian colleagues, and especially for this species, by Karen Stryer, who was another DeVore student and is now just an amazing person because she has carried out what is now the longest running study of any South American primate on this fantastic animal. And that's been going now for 35 years. I could go give you a whole story about this animal, but I'll leave that for now. I'm sure Karen's probably spoken here already a number of times, I would imagine. If not, she should. So I wound up doing my thesis in Suriname, which was a little bit easier in terms of logistics, studying the synecology, the interactions among the 8 different species that occur in the Guyanas, and also looking at how people, indigenous people in particular, interacted with primates, how they used them as a source of food, and so on and so forth. In 1984, I also extended my work to Madagascar, which is, as I say in a few minutes, it's the highest priority for primate conservation in the world, and this is the wonderful Indri, which is the largest of the living lemurs. And in my role as chair of the primate specialist group of IUCN, I've had the opportunity to travel all around the world looking at primates from the northern Peruvian Andes, where you have this animal like the yellow-tailed woolly monkey, which I rediscovered in 1974 after it hadn't been seen for about 50 years, to northern Colombia, the cotton-top tamarin, to the forests of Central Africa and the amazing bonobo, which is our closest living relative, to many different places in Asia, from India, where you have fantastic nocturnal species like the slender loris, and of course the orangutans. And some of you may not know that they just described this year, a new species of orangutan from Sumatra, the Tapanuli orang, which was the first great ape species that had been described since 1929. And unfortunately, it's a critically endangered species. And also some very bizarre animals like this Yunnan snub-nosed monkey, which only occurs in Yunnan province in China and lives at a higher altitude than any other non-human primate, over 4,000 meters, 14,000 feet. Now, because non-human primates are largely tropical forest species, I've spent a very large portion of my time working in the tropical forests of the world, from the Brazilian Amazon to these amazing Tepui formations in southern Venezuela and southern Colombia. To me, this is the most beautiful landscape on the planet, bar none. It's just it's really an incredible, incredible landscape. And how many of you have read Arthur Conan Doyle's Lost World? A few of you. You should read it. He bases his Lost World on top of the tepuis of southern Venezuela. And of course, he placed dinosaurs and all sorts of other things there. But there aren't any dinosaurs left, but these are pretty fascinating places. Mountains of China, the forests of the Congo, and these spectacular baobab forests of Madagascar. That's my oldest son with me in Madagascar. I've even spent time in some of the rainforests that don't have primates, and particularly on the island of New Guinea. You don't have primates there, but you do have what are more or less the equivalent of primates in these spectacular tree kangaroos, tree-dwelling kangaroos that they don't look like they belong in trees, but they actually do spend their lives in the trees and are quite amazing animals. There's about a dozen species of these. So, what is biodiversity? You all know this, but just to repeat some of my favorite definitions, it's a wealth of genes, species, ecosystems, and ecological processes that makes our living planet what it is. It's the sum total of all life on Earth. It's our living legacy to future generations. But what doesn't get enough attention is that it is also the basic underpinning of sustainable development and long-term human well-being. If we lose the biodiversity, we're in big trouble. In essence, biodiversity is us, and all of us, everything living out there is interconnected. A few facts about biodiversity that don't get enough attention. We have described by science, and this is according to Ed Wilson, about 1.9 million species of everything, plants, animals, microorganisms. Estimates of total diversity run from 5 million to 10 million to 30 million or more. There's kind of a general agreement around this 10 million figure, but it could be a lot more. But what this means is that although we can send spaceships to the farthest reaches of the solar system, we can put millions, billions of bits of information on tiny computer chips, we don't know to within an order of magnitude how many other life forms share the planet with us. New species are being discovered on an ongoing basis, and in many ways we're living in a new era of species discovery comparable to the latter part of the 19th century when all these great explorer naturalists went out and just collected bucket loads of species new to science. Now, this lack of knowledge is not that surprising when you think of canopy rainforest beetles in the Amazon or deep sea ocean trench fishes and other organisms. But our ignorance applies even to our closest living relatives, the non-human primates. This is a species of marmoset monkey that I described from the central Brazilian Amazon in 1992. It's known as Mico mauese, the Mauese marmoset. And I named it after the Mauese Indians, who were the first to cultivate guaraná. You know what guaraná is? Some of you know what guaraná is. Yes, you know, of course. It's this wonderful fruit from the central Amazon that has 3 times the caffeine of coffee. And when I go to Brazil, I drink lots of it. It's great stuff. And it's an ingredient in many of these energy drinks that you find out there now as well. So I thought it was worthwhile to name this monkey after the Indians that discovered guaraná, and also this monkey lives in their territory. This is another new species, actually a new genus of marmoset that we described, again, from the central Brazilian Amazon, Calibella. It's the dwarf marmoset, little guy about this big. In all, I've been involved in the description of 21 species new to science, 18 primates, 3 turtles, and we've probably got another 10 or so in the works at one level or another, which will be coming out in the next few years. In all, our community has described 87 new primate species since 2000. That's about close to 20% of all known primate species, which when you think about it is pretty amazing. So what are the threats to biodiversity? Well, slash and burn agriculture, big issue in most of the tropics. Slash and burn actually works at low human population densities, but when you have high human populations, it's just the rollback effect and the forest doesn't have an opportunity to regenerate. Large-scale commercial agriculture and livestock production is without a doubt the #1 threat. Cattle and other livestock, huge impact in the tropical forest regions. And then these crops like oil palm, soy, sugarcane are devastating many, many areas. This is oil palm, really has had an impact in Southeast Asia, particularly in places like Sumatra and Borneo. This is what the fruit looks like. Unfortunately, it has a very high biomass, and it can generate a lot of revenue per area, and so it's quite popular. Now, how many of you have seen this series on Showtime, Years of Living Dangerously? One? Only one. My God. Please go and see it. Oh, two. Very few. I thought on Showtime it would get much more attention. It came out a few years ago, an 8-part series in which they used celebrities to focus on different issues relating to climate change. And I had the great privilege of traveling for 9 days with Harrison Ford in Sumatra and Borneo and looking at the impacts of oil palm and the destruction of forests to open up lands for oil palm production. Quite an experience. And he was so incensed that he met with the Minister of Forestry in Indonesia and really gave him a hard time, which made the headline news in Indonesia for several weeks. Logging. Logging of tropical forests, commercial logging carried out under the banner of sustainability is still continuing. It's not sustainable. It is simply not sustainable, and it should not be called sustainable logging. It's a 19th century activity that does not have a place in today's world. Charcoal and firewood production, big issue, especially in places like Africa. Flooding of vast areas of forest for hydroelectric projects. This is the Guri Dam in southern Venezuela. Mining activities of many different kinds. This is gold mining at the edge of the Pantanal region in Brazil. And this very insidious threat of bushmeat hunting. Now, this is very serious in places like West and Central Africa, and we're not talking about just subsistence hunting, but rather commercial hunting of bushmeat for sale in the markets of large cities where it fetches a higher price than chicken, beef, or fish, and it's impacting even our closest living relatives. Invasive species, another problem, the classic being the mongoose in the Caribbean. This one is another one of my favorites, the cane toad or the marine toad, which comes from South America. It's been introduced all over the place. It's a major problem in Australia, New Guinea, the Pacific Islands. You go down to southern Florida, it's jumping around there as well. You put out a bowl of dog food, it'll come and eat the dog food. If the dog bites it, the dog dies because it has very strong venom in its parotid glands. Very hard to eradicate. Disease. And I saw that one of the previous presentations here was about emerging diseases. I wish I heard that. Ebola is a big problem in Central Africa, and it impacts people, obviously, but also chimpanzees and gorillas with devastating effect. And one of my big fears in primate conservation is one of these days it's going to jump from Central Africa over to the Virunga volcanoes, where you have the mountain gorillas, only about 800 of those left, and it could wipe those mountain gorillas out in no time. And yellow fever. You would think we'd have yellow fever under control, but we don't. Last year, there was a major outbreak of yellow fever in the Atlantic forest region of Brazil, an area that's very fragmented to begin with, and it had a very heavy impact on certain primates, especially howler monkeys, which for some reason are particularly susceptible to yellow fever. They were falling out of the trees. And it looks like there might be another outbreak this year. And then we have this overarching threat of global climate change, obviously a major threat, but in many ways it presents us with a unique opportunity that I'll say a little bit about shortly. Loss is irreversible. Once we lose a species of plant or animal, it won't ever be seen again. And we're facing an impending extinction crisis, unlike anything since the loss of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. So what do we need to do? First of all, I've spent a lot of my career focusing on priority setting, being strategic. Can't do everything all at once. Focus on those areas that have the greatest risk and the highest concentration of species, and do that based on the best available science. Their basic premises: all biodiversity is important. All nations should do everything possible to conserve their living natural resources. But biodiversity is not evenly distributed over the planet. It's heavily concentrated in a relatively small area, a large portion of which has already been heavily impacted by human activities. And as it turns out, these areas also happen to have some of the highest ecosystem service values, which means they're very important in terms of human well-being and poverty alleviation. And that gives us some win-win situations. Richard mentioned already the two that I've focused most attention on. I won't say anything about the megadiversity concept right now. It's something that is very interesting. If you want to talk more about it, I'd be happy to talk to you about it later. I'm going to focus on the two that we've used the most, which are hotspots and high biodiversity wilderness areas. We've, aside from the scientific articles that we've done, we've published a number of books on the hotspots concept. I don't know if we have those here, do we? Maybe not. If anyone is interested in these books, let me know, and I'd be happy to send them to you free of charge. They summarize nicely what the concept is all about. But what hotspots really are for is prioritizing areas of high irreplaceability as measured by endemic species, found nowhere else. I don't think I have to define endemism for this audience, and a high degree of threat. As Richard said, this was first invented by Norman Myers, an amazing British ecologist back in 1988. He came up initially with 10 hotspots, and I saw his list and I said, wow, this is a great concept. I got in touch with him, as did several other scientists. He published another article 2 years later with our input, adding a few more, bringing it up to 18. And then when I left World Wildlife Fund for Conservation International in 1989, I took this concept with me. We revised it a number of times. We're now up to 36 of these regions. They're mainly in the tropical forest regions of the world, but you also have other biome types there, the Mediterranean type systems. All 5 of those are hotspots, the Mediterranean itself, California Floristic Province, the Cape Flora of South Africa, southwestern Australia, and the coast of Chile. These are all Mediterranean type hotspots. The original extent of the hotspots was about 23 million square kilometers. This is about Russia and Australia put together. About 16% of the land surface of the planet. Almost 90% has already been lost in these hotspots. What remains intact is a little over 3 million square kilometers. That's about the size of India or the 5 largest American states. A little more than 2% of the land surface of the planet. In this tiny area, you have, as endemic species found nowhere else, more than 50% of all plants and more than 40% of all vertebrates. If you want to look at the most endangered species using the IUCN Red List of threatened species, you all know what the IUCN is, right? International Union for Conservation of Nature produces the Red List, which is the oldest, most basic data set in the conservation business, goes back about 60 years. If you use that Red List and look at the concentration of endangered species in the hotspots, you get more than 83% of the birds, more than 80% of the mammals, more than 90% of the amphibians concentrated in this tiny area. The best example of a hotspot is without a doubt the island of Madagascar. It's about the size of Texas, located 400 kilometers off the east coast of Africa, and the 4th largest island in the world. But it's the largest oceanic island. The other 3 larger islands, Greenland, New Guinea, and Borneo, are all continental islands, and they were connected as recently as the Pleistocene to other larger land masses. Madagascar has been out there on its own for at least 90 million years, so evolution has kind of gone on its own path there. You get a great diversity of ecosystems, from rainforests to these wonderful giant baobab forests. I love baobabs. There are 8 species in the world, 7 of them are in Madagascar, 6 of them are endemic, and I just want to paint little faces and noses and mouths on all of them. Every one of them has a personality. I want to photograph everyone out there. And you have the southern spiny desert ecosystem, which has incredibly high levels of plant endemism. 95% of the plants in this southern part of Madagascar aren't even found anywhere else in Madagascar. Plant diversity overall is about 15,000 species, which is just a little less than all of North America north of Mexico. And that area of North America north of Mexico is 37 times larger. Reptile diversity also off the charts, more than 400 species, new ones being described every year. Again, this is more than all of North America north of Mexico, and most of these, more than 90% of these, are endemic. But of course, the global ambassadors for Madagascar, the best known, most popular group of organisms there are the lemurs, this unique radiation of non-human primates found nowhere else. 5 genera, 5 families, 15 genera, 111 taxa, and counting, because we keep finding new ones. They're found only on Madagascar, except for a couple of species that have been introduced onto the Comores. They range in size from Madame Bert's mouse lemur, which is the smallest of all living primates, about 30 grams. That's an adult in my hand. Up to the Indri, which is the largest of the living lemurs, looks like a cross between a teddy bear and a giant panda and bounds from tree to tree like an arboreal kangaroo. And the most bizarre of all primates, the aye-aye, which has been separated from other primates for 40 million years. And if you think the adult aye-aye is weird looking, look at this baby. This one was born in the Duke Lemur Center in North Carolina, and they named it E.T. I think they're cute. A lot of people think they're ugly, but I think they're so bizarre that you got to consider them cute. Unfortunately, Madagascar is also a world champion in terms of habitat destruction, habitat loss. We used to think that our own species got there about 2,000 years ago, but a paper just came out like weeks ago that I haven't even read in its entirety yet that says maybe people got there as long ago as 10,000 years ago, which would kind of change some of our interpretations, and I'm still trying to absorb what that all means. Unfortunately, hunting, bushmeat hunting, is a problem there as well, and it impacts even the Indri. The Indri is the giant panda of Madagascar. It's the equivalent of China's giant panda. If you kill a giant panda in China, you're going to go to jail for a long time, and yet you're still getting poaching of Indris in Madagascar, and we're just trying to get that under control. Madagascar has the worst erosion anywhere on the planet, full stop. I've been to Haiti. Madagascar's erosion is worse. Every year the rivers run red with eroded soil, and the astronauts, when they first went to space, they were photographing the Earth. They saw this huge plume of red eroded soil going out into the Indian Ocean from western Madagascar. It was so evident you could see it from space. Madagascar is also one of those examples of recent major extinctions. I'm not talking about the dinosaurs here, but I'm talking about major extinctions within the past few hundred to few thousand years. This is the elephant bird, the largest bird that ever lived, 9 feet tall, weighed half a ton. And another article that I just saw has just described an even larger elephant bird species than the one that we thought was the biggest of all birds. This one's Aepyornis maximus, and this new one is called Aepyornis titan. So you can get some idea of how big it is. This is all that's left of the elephant birds, these enormous eggs. And you also lost this incredible radiation of giant lemurs. This is Megalatopus. It's a koala-like animal that weighed about 100 pounds, much bigger than a koala. And here you have, in silhouette, the largest of the living lemurs compared to these giant lemurs, all of which went extinct very recently. The one in the lower left-hand corner, Archaeoindris, grew to be as large as a gorilla, and it occupied a niche similar to the giant ground sloth of the Americas. The two that are hanging there occupied sloth-like niches, similar to the South American tree sloths, but Paleopropithecus in particular got much bigger. It was like 100 pounds. 90% of Madagascar is already lost, and the remaining area of natural habitat is about 50 to 60,000 square kilometers. Now, I forget how big the state of Massachusetts is. My usual measure of states is New Jersey. This is about 3 New Jerseys. So you're getting, it's probably about 5 or 6 states of Massachusetts. You're getting all this amazing biodiversity, globally important biodiversity, unique evolutionary, deep lineages concentrated in this very small area, which leads us to consider Madagascar to be the world's highest priority biodiversity hotspot. But what's happening in Madagascar is not unique to there. It's happening in most of these other hotspots as well. So what do? Well, in 2002, a new president came into power in Madagascar. Marc Ravalomanana was his name. And we met with him early on and said, look, Mr. President, you've got some protected areas here, but you really need to have more protected areas to protect this wonderful biodiversity that you have. So why don't you double protected area coverage, parks and reserves? And he said, he was an ambitious, charismatic guy, and he said, double it, I'll triple it. And at the World Parks Congress in South Africa in September 2003, he made a commitment to triple protected area coverage over the next 5 years. He said, well, you guys have to help us to do this. Find $50 million for it. So over the next 5 years, we raised $50 million in a trust fund to help him do this. We also brought all sorts of celebrities in. This is Jeff Corwin. Most of you have probably seen his television program. We brought him to Madagascar. Congressional delegations. This gentleman to my right is Tom Udall from New Mexico, a senator, really a very active conservationist. You know who this guy is? This is Richard Branson, who loves lemurs more than I do. He really loves lemurs. He has them on his island in the Caribbean, and he's a great ambassador. I took him to Madagascar a few years back, and he is a very good ambassador for lemur conservation. We even had a little help from Hollywood with this wonderfully biologically inaccurate series of films. 3 films that really kind of have no basis in biology at all, but they did put Madagascar on the map in terms of at least the US audience, which was something. So at the end of 2008, I thought, wow, this is all going very well. I'm going to write an article called Madagascar, an Incipient Success Story. But as often happens in these countries, and even in our own, the winds of politics blow in many different directions. And in the beginning of 2009, this character, 37-year-old disc jockey who was the mayor of the capital city, staged the coup, kicked out President Marc Ravalomanana, and for the next 5 years, it was chaos. Not a single country recognized Madagascar's government. The donors, the major donors, for the most part, pulled out, and a lot of things started to go wrong. Fortunately, in 2013, he was elected out of office. A new president came in, this gentleman here with the red circle around him, President Eri Rajanari Mampianina, who has the longest name of any head of state ever. It took me about a week to learn how to pronounce it. But he's been largely ineffectual over the past 5 years. He brought the international community back, but he's not been a very strong leader. In a month, we have elections once again in Madagascar. And elections there generally result in significant chaos for months or sometimes even a year or two. So we're waiting with bated breath to see what happens. I hope Ravalomanana, the one who made the tripling commitment, gets back in. That's a good possibility, but we'll see. Even through this difficult period, this tripling commitment continued. And we've managed to actually get 3 times more protected areas established in Madagascar. Now, are they all well managed? Are they all functioning the way they should? No. Some of them are good. The large majority of them still need a lot of work, but at least on paper, they're there, which is the first step. So after all these political upheavals, not just in Madagascar, but everywhere, I've come to the conclusion that the real focus in any conservation efforts has to be on the local communities, the local people, the indigenous people who live in close proximity to the protected areas that you're trying to save and the species in them. This has been very successful in Madagascar. We've done it in a variety of different ways, developing ecotourism, a lot of public education and outreach. There's a children's group with a giant Indri. And I should say that you have someone here who's done some amazing work as well. Do you know Chris Golden? Chris Golden was an undergraduate here. I think he's still faculty here, right? Yeah. He was one of the people who really called attention to the bushmeat crisis in Madagascar. He's working on a whole bunch of health-related issues, and he's also looking at alternatives to bushmeat. And that work is really quite amazing. He also is just an incredible linguist. He learned to speak Malagasy in about 3 months, and he speaks it fluently, which is something I can't even do after more than 30 years of going there. The other end of the spectrum in terms of conservation priorities is the wilderness areas. As Richard mentioned, these are mainly the Amazon, the high biodiversity wilderness areas, mainly Amazonia, the Congo forest, the island of New Guinea. Like the hotspots, they have high biodiversity and high endemism, but unlike the hotspots, they're still largely intact, 70, 80, 90%. So it's a very different dynamic. The most intact rainforest area left on Earth is in the northeastern Amazon in what's called the Guiana Shield region. Fantastic place where I spent a lot of my time, and especially in Suriname, which is the greenest country on Earth. Now, I find that before tonight, how many of you knew about Suriname? Okay, good, most of you. Oh, this is Harvard, so that's to be expected. When I ask that question, usually I get 1 or 2 hands going up. Now, what we used to do was define the position of Suriname as being between Jonestown and Devil's Island. Good, you know what that means, because every other audience I've talked to, I get blank stares. Everybody's forgotten about Jonestown. Then I reminded people in Indiana that Jim Jones came from Indiana and actually went to Indiana University. So, bad guy. And of course, Devil's Island, Papillon, Steve McQueen, political prisoner. That one worked, but I think I'm going to move it out of my presentation now because there's too few people in this new generation that know what either one of those are. Suriname is 94% covered in forest, which is phenomenal. Any analysis you see globally that looks at percent forest cover, Suriname's at the top. This is what the map looks like, pretty green. It's got amazing cultural diversity, which I'm not going to go into now, just talk about the biodiversity. Cock of the Rock, you have the most accessible for, any birders in the audience? Yeah, I thought so. The most accessible lek of the Guyanan Cock of the Rock anywhere. Wonderful sea turtle nesting beaches. It's an important overwintering site for North American migrants. And of course, it has these primates that drew me to the country in the first place, like the white-faced saki, the bearded saki, squirrel monkey, and 5 other species. And this is my favorite species, or one of my favorite species in Suriname. This is the blue poison dart frog. Now, in 1976, I went way down into southern Suriname. This is endemic to Suriname. I was only the 2nd person ever to see this animal in the wild after the person who described it. And I was collecting a few for the Bronx Zoo at that time. And stupid, 20-year-old kid, I was collecting with my bare hands, which you don't do with poison dart frogs. And I'd been walking through the open savanna in my shorts. My legs were cut up. I scratched my legs. All of a sudden, I got this really intense tingling feeling in my legs, very unpleasant. I was basically being toxed by the venom by the poison from this dart frog. So I had to sit in a stream with a stiff laundry brush and laundry detergent and just scrape my legs for about 2 or 3 hours to get the toxin out. Fortunately, that was not this frog, because this one comes from the Chocó region of Colombia, only in a single river. This is Phyllobates terribilis, aptly named. When I was in Suriname, this one hadn't even been described yet, I don't think. This one is so toxic that the Embera Indians who hunt with blowguns rub the darts on the back of this frog, and they can kill a jaguar with it. If you touch it and put your fingers in your mouth, you're dead in about 5 minutes. No joke. This one is amazingly toxic. The amazing thing about these poison dart frogs, if you put them in a terrarium, keep them there for 3 months, feed them crickets, you can pick them up and lick them if you're so inclined. Because they need to be in their natural environment. And they're basically little pharmacists who collect, mainly from ants and some other invertebrates, all of these different chemicals, mix them together like a pharmaceutical genius, and present them to you on a silver platter as a poison. And these poisons, some of these poisons have real medicinal value. But if you take them out of their natural habitat, nothing happens. So the bottom line with the hotspots and the high biodiversity wilderness areas is they're the top priority in terrestrial biodiversity conservation. I emphasize the terrestrial because I could give you another presentation on marine issues. We don't have time. It's not my specialty. But I'm talking here about terrestrial. If we fail in the hotspots, we're going to lose a major portion of the world's terrestrial biodiversity, regardless of how successful we are anywhere else. These areas are so important. They have such high concentrations of endemic species, endangered species. If we lose these areas, and we could lose a lot of them in the next 5, 10, 20 years, we're going to have a much poorer planet as a result. Now, as it turns out, they're also important for many other reasons. If you're interested in human cultural diversity, take linguistic diversity as a measure of culture. There are about almost 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. 74% of those are spoken in the hotspots and high biodiversity wilderness areas, and that includes most of the languages spoken by a few dozen, a few hundred, a few thousand individuals. So you've got the endangered cultures, endangered languages, in the same places as most of your endangered species. Hotspots are also a very effective fundraising tool. At Conservation International in the 1990s, we had a campaign to save the hotspots. For several years, that raised about $1 billion. The following decade, the last decade, we had another campaign, largely based on the hotspots, called Future for Life. That one also raised about $1 billion. So it works pretty well. So what are some of the actions needed? And I'm going to give you the primate example, what we're doing with primates. I'm not going to go through everything, just give you some of what I think are the most important examples. First of all, you've got to assess conservation status. You've got to know where the species you're working on are, what their conservation status is. Very important, and the IUCN Red List is, as I said earlier, the oldest, most fundamental data set in the conservation business. The way you do this is you organize workshops. This is one that we held in Rome, bringing together experts on African primates, and you have them do a data dump over the course of 5 or 6 days, and then you reorganize that information and you present it to the IUCN for processing. We've had, in the past few years, 5 of these workshops for primates, including 2 for Madagascar, 1 for South America, 1 for Asia, and 1 for African primates. What we found with all of this is about 62% of all primates are threatened, which makes primates the most endangered larger group of mammals. So what do we do with this information? Well, we use it to produce action plans, something we've been doing since the late 1970s. You identify the priority projects, you figure out what they cost, and you present it in a document to donors. We've done dozens and dozens of these. This is one that we did in 2002 for Western chimpanzees in West Africa. We're in the process now of doing a revision of this one 16 years down the line. And this one we did after that first lemur workshop in 2012, an action plan for lemurs from 2013 to 2016. And what we did with this one, which is interesting, we published the fact that we had done it in the journal Science, which is the most prestigious, most widely read scientific journal. We were asking for $7 million in this action plan, and a donor came out of the woodwork and wound up giving us $8 million. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's nice when it does. Another thing we're doing is focusing on ecotourism, and I emphasize here appropriate ecotourism, because I believe ecotourism is one of the best ways, if not the best way, to demonstrate to local communities living in proximity to key protected areas and where you want to save species that it pays for them, that it generates economic benefits for them, and it does so quickly. Now, what I'm doing is in part based on a birdwatching model. This is my son, John. He's been birdwatching now for 22 years. Peter knows him. I think he's closing in on about 5,000 species in the wild. And what I saw with him is how amazingly interconnected this birdwatching community is at a global level. And what most people don't realize is that birdwatching is a big industry. This is an old set of figures, but from 2011, but it says the economic impact just in the US is about $40 billion. And those who self-identify as birdwatchers, close to 50 million people. Okay, some of them are just hanging, nest boxes out in their backyard, but they're part of this network, which is extremely powerful. And this movie, The Big Year, how many of you have seen this? Great movie. I love this movie because the Owen Wilson character is exactly my son. It portrays the fanaticism of birdwatchers, but also how committed and how dedicated they are to conservation and just getting out there and seeing the birds. And this is something that we need to use. But based on what I saw with birds and what my son was doing, I said, why don't we do the same thing for primates? Let's start a tradition of primate watching and primate life listing. Okay, there's 11,000 plus birds, maybe more than that, and they're everywhere. Primates are not. Primates are mostly in the tropics, and there's only 700 of them. But they're pretty cool. They're relatively easy to see if you go to these countries. So why not start a tradition of primate watching and primate life listing? I started this about 10 years ago. And we have some great models. Mountain gorillas. Mountain gorillas in the Virunga volcanoes of Rwanda, Uganda, and Congo. You don't go to Congo right now, but certainly Rwanda and Uganda are great places for this. They just jacked the price up for going and seeing a mountain gorilla for 1 hour to $1,500. You want to see one the next day, it's another $1,500. And there's a waiting list of months, if not years, to get the permits to go and see these animals. It's really incredible how this has developed into an industry largely owned and run by the communities that's generating vast amounts of revenues for these local communities in Rwanda. Now, there's a rule with the mountain gorillas: you can't get closer than 7 meters to them. You have to keep away from them. And that's a good rule. Unfortunately, the gorillas haven't read the rule book. And this is one visit that when my second son and I were sitting on the edge of a hill there watching a group of females and infants and young blackbacks. And we said, where's the silverback? And all of a sudden, the silverback comes out behind us, brushes up against us, totally ignoring us like we were rocks. And he just moved on, and we're like shaking. He got closer than 7 meters, so he didn't pay much attention to the rule. But in any case, it's a phenomenal program. And also, the Virunga volcanoes and another even larger national park called Nyungwe, which is getting a lot of attention in Rwanda now as well. It has everything except mountain gorillas. It's got chimps, and it's got more primate species than the Virungas. It's getting tourism now as well. Those two forests are about 70 to 80% of the water in Rwanda. You cut down those forests, you not only use the primates and everything else there. What happens to Rwanda, one of the most highly populated countries, most densely populated countries in all of Africa, if you lose the sources of water? So it's all interconnected. Another great place for primate watching, of course, is the island of Madagascar. 111 species. It's easier to rack up a list of 20 or 30 lemurs within a matter of a few weeks in Madagascar than any place else in the world. If you want to see 20 species of monkeys in the Congo or in the Amazon, you better mount a 3-month expedition. In Madagascar, it's very easy. And they're super cute, especially these sea fox who will dance for you, and the Indris, and many of the others. It's even picking up in China, Golden Monkey Valley. The golden monkeys, which are the second most important flagship species in China after the giant panda, they're starting to do this for golden monkeys as well. It's not really done in the way that we think it should be, but at least it's started, and it's providing justification. Habituating one group is providing a justification for protecting all the other groups in the neighboring forest. But I would like to see it done better. To facilitate primate watching and primate life listing, we've produced a lot of different materials. I have as a sample here the latest English version of our lemur field guide. We've done field guides for Colombia, for West Africa, for many other places. And we also produce even more of these pocket guides, which are basically very thin illustrated lists that you can put in your back pocket if you don't want to carry the heavy guide with you. We have a lemur conservation network that brings together people interested in lemurs around the world. And we are launching an iPhone app for lemur watching. See how that goes. We are light years behind the bird people. We're probably 30 years or more behind the bird people, but at least we're trying, at least we're getting started. Another key point is the critical importance of protected areas. Protected areas, national parks, reserves, whatever you want to call them, are simply the most important tool we have for achieving biodiversity conservation and ensuring the continued flow of ecosystem services that are essential to our own survival. Some countries over the past 40 years or so have done a great job with this, the Brazilians in particular. And what we're seeing emerging now is increasing emphasis on partnering with indigenous people and local communities through what are called indigenous and community-owned conservation areas. If you look at traditional protected areas, national parks, reserves, they occupy about 15% of the land surface of the planet. These indigenous and community-owned areas are already at about 12 to 13%. And some figures show that indigenous people are the stewards of 20% or more of the terrestrial planet. If you want an example of this, look at this map of Amazonia. In green, you have the traditional protected areas, and in orange, you have the indigenous lands. And I think one of the big growth areas now, especially in places like Amazonia, is going to be the creation of new indigenous lands. One example, I've been working with the Kayapo people since 1992. This is in the southern Brazilian Amazon, an area that's largely surrounded now by soy and cattle pasture. These are amazing people. This is Raoni, who is the famous chief of one of the chiefs of the Kayapo. He's one of the few guys who still wears that lip disc. He still goes to international meetings. He was a friend of Sting in the late 1980s, the early 90s. And the guy must be 90 years old, and he still appears in international conferences. They occupy an area of about 11.5 million hectares, which is, again, I don't know what Massachusetts is, but I think it's about 10 times the size of Massachusetts, or about the size of the state of New York or the state of Virginia, only 8,000 people. And they're great warriors. They live in these traditional villages, about 18 of these villages. And this is what they look like when they're dressed in traditional garb. Now, you've all seen Avatar, I assume, right? The film. I very strongly believe that Avatar is based on the story of the Kayapo. James Cameron has helped to support the Kayapo people. And when I watched that film for the first time, I said, got to be a connection. I don't have that confirmed, but I'll bet any amount of money that he based Avatar on what's happening to the Kayapo and other indigenous people in South America. We've also done something similar with the Trio and Wayana people in the southern part of Suriname and neighboring parts of Brazil and French Guiana. We just had an indigenous area, self-declared by the indigenous people there, of 7.2 million hectares. And that only has about 3,000 people in it. This is what most of it looks like. Here you see, Here you see where it's located, this kind of orangey area in the southern part of Suriname. It's contiguous with similar areas in French Guiana, Brazil, and Guyana. Together, these indigenous and other protected areas come to about 20 million hectares, which is about the size of the state of Florida. And it's got about 10,000 indigenous people in it, and that's it. So you can imagine that we still have great opportunities in places like this to protect vast areas of forest and the globally important ecosystem services that they provide, and of course also the biodiversity. Now, just last week we had a meeting actually 2 weeks ago now, in National Geographic talking about what should be the post-2020 targets for protected area coverage through the Biodiversity Convention, the international treaty dealing with biodiversity, and other international structures. And we were talking about 30% of the terrestrial planet protected. That's a nice number, but we're almost at that already if you add the indigenous lands. So I really believe in this whole concept of nature needs half, and that we need at least 50% of the planet protected through networks of effectively managed protected areas and indigenous lands. And this is something that the great Ed Wilson, one of the many things that he's pioneered, he came up with this concept in the 1980s, and he just published this book, Half Earth, on the topic. So I highly recommend that to you if you haven't already seen it. Climate change. I talked about climate change being an opportunity. I was at the Paris meeting in 2015. It was amazing. After multiple meetings over the past few decades, we finally came to an international agreement. Unfortunately, the US temporarily has pulled out of it, although it can't officially pull out until about a month before the 2020 election. So we're still officially in it. And I think that the foolish move we've done with the climate convention is just, it's a blip. I think we'll be back in it at some point down the line. What's emerged from these climate discussions is the importance of forest carbon, REDD+, the reduction in emissions from deforestation and degradation. And what we're seeing is there's increasing evidence that rainforests, tropical rainforests in particular, are at least 30% of the solution to climate change, nature-based solutions. And they're the most immediate low-cost solution. They're far less costly than anything else. And what's particularly exciting is that this REDD concept and looking at climate change shows the great interconnectedness of species conservation, forest conservation, and dealing with climate change, and also indigenous people. A recent paper that came out showed that 1% of forest trees in Amazonia sequester about 50% of the carbon. 1%. That's about 20 species. When I looked at the list of tree species, it's mostly slow-growing, hardwood, emergent trees. I recognized a lot of them because I studied these animals in Suriname. This is the black spider monkey. Somebody here was telling me they're going to start a project on them. Where are you? Somewhere. Anyway, this is an amazing animal. It disperses these hardwood tree species all over the place. And it is, from an ecological, long-term perspective, extremely important. This is also done by frugivorous birds like curassows and some of their relatives, by tapirs, which gobble up everything on the forest floor, and even by forest floor tortoises, which in some places still exist at fairly high densities, swallow these fruits whole and just go around the forest dispersing them. Unfortunately, these hardwood species that sequester 50% of the carbon are also the first things that get logged out when people go in and log under the banner of sustainable logging. And when hunters go in, these are the first species that they hunt out. So if we don't protect these animals and these trees, over the course of a few generations, we lose a major portion of the carbon capture capacity of these forests. Now, I thought this might be unique to the Amazon, but then about a year after that Amazon paper came out, there was another one that came out that showed similar patterns for the old world tropics, especially, Asia and African tropical forests. So the message is slowly getting across that forests are worth more standing than cut down for other land uses, and now maybe a lot more. And you even have an international mechanism that, if it starts functioning properly, could really compensate countries at scale for this. One is the Green Climate Fund, which has about $10 billion in it. It's supposed to go to $100 billion. And through Conservation International, we've actually done one of the first projects, $70 million for Madagascar. And like a lot of these multilateral agencies, especially when they start up, they're kind of a mess. They're still finding their way. But if this works, it's going to have enormous impact. So a few final points. Celebrities. You saw Harrison Ford, amazing guy, amazingly committed to conservation, and he's the only celebrity that not only gives his time, but also makes major financial contributions. I was so honored to have him at this Indianapolis Prize event doing the presentation of the award. This is one of my favorite pictures. The fuzzy white hair there is me, in case you didn't realize it. I already mentioned Richard Branson, great celebrity. Jane Goodall, of course, she should win the Nobel Prize. She's an amazing character. You probably know who this guy is. He's been helping us with turtle campaigns. You know who he is? Okay, James Bond, okay. And how many of you know who this is? God, she's getting forgotten. This is the greatest female tennis player ever until Serena beat her record by 1 last year, Steffi Graf. She's also a very committed conservationist. I took her and Andre Agassi to Africa a few years ago. Here we are with a leopard looking hungrily at her in South Africa. And afterwards, the driver of this vehicle, they have open vehicles in South Africa, a little scary. He said, yeah, sometimes that leopard, female leopard, she jumps into the front seat. So fortunately, she didn't do it on this particular occasion. So the final point, future generations. These are my kids. This is my son, John, with a box turtle when he was very little. There he is with his siblings in the Galapagos. he's become, as I said, a major committed bird guy, and he's doing his PhD at Oxford now on the cultural significance of conservation. I don't actually understand what he's doing for his thesis, but it sounds pretty important. This is my second son, Mickey, who was showing signs of being a great herpetologist, working on turtles and snakes and lizards, and there he is with a tuatara. But we must have beaten up on him too much when he was little, and something got damaged in his brain because 3 years ago he switched to plants. And now he's hope there's no botanist in the audience. And now he's a pretty accomplished botanist focused on aeroids and other epiphytes. So at least he's doing conservation, right? And this is my daughter, Juliana, who's making noises about being a primatologist, although she hasn't fully committed yet. And here we are looking for jaguars in the Pantanal region of Brazil. We saw 8 at Pantanal. If you want to see jaguars, if you want to see amazing biodiversity in South America, go to the Pantanal. It gets better every year. 8 jaguars in about 6 days. So to finish up, together we have the opportunity to change the course of conservation history. We should be able to conserve the full range of global biodiversity, maintain critical habitats, and achieve, at least as an aspirational goal, 0 extinctions. But we only have a very short window of time in which to act. And a lot of it depends on the younger people in the audience. Our generation has done its thing. I'm still going to do my thing for the next 10 or 20 years, or as long as I can keep walking. But the future really depends on the young people in the audience here. And I hope that you'll all work with the same level of commitment that conservationists in our generation did. There just weren't enough of us. But there's more of you now, and I think you can all get the job done. So with that, I'll end there, and thank you very much for your attention.